Now, military justice was supposed to be administered blindly. It didn't matter what religion you were, what your ethnic background was. If you committed some sort of an offense, there were textbook punishments for those offenses. But especially as the Mexican War loomed, the Irish began to find that there were two separate sets of justice in the military. Again, there's ample documentation of the fact that the Irish were dealt with more harshly by many of the officers than so-called native-born American soldiers.
Fed up with the abuse and a wave of anti-Irish sentiment, a company of Irish soldiers from Georgia rioted aboard a steamboat on the Rio Grande. The Burrita incident was symptomatic of a growing disillusionment among the immigrant soldiers.
These guys were not assimilated in any way into American society. Some of them likely joined the Army seeking a means to earn respect, possibly earn citizenship, and to find their way in America as American soldiers. But what they found all through the war was that these officers hated them, that the regular soldiers hated them, yet they were marched in to face the Mexican guns battle after battle, but they were not accepted.
President Polk had no trouble finding support for his war. The New York Evening Post editorialized, "We believe it is part of our destiny to civilize that beautiful country." But anti-war sentiment was strong among the American people. A young lieutenant named Ulysses S. Grant adamantly opposed the conflict. He stated, "I regard the war as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger over a weaker nation." Congressman Abraham Lincoln had strong reservations about the war, and abolitionist Frederick Douglass called it cruel and iniquitous. Congressman John Quincy Adams accused President Polk of starting the conflict to extend slave territories. Adams collapsed and died of a heart attack on the floor of Congress during one of his anti-war speeches. Among the troops, morale was low. Even before war was declared, large numbers of American soldiers began deserting. John Riley, who was posted near the Rio Grande, was disgruntled about many things, including his low rank. One morning, he excused himself to attend Mass and never returned. Some historians believe that Riley and other Catholic soldiers were drawn to the familiar sounds of church bells and Catholic rituals across the Rio Grande in Matamoros. Mexican fandangos and fiestas reminded the Irish soldiers of their own dances and jigs. Others claimed the U.S. troops were ensnared by the charms of young Mexican women.
I think because it was a war like Vietnam, that nobody knew why they were fighting it. I mean, you know that in the diary of Ulysses S. Grant, he wrote back to his fiancée saying, you know, we have no moral right to go into Mexico, but it's my country, right or wrong.
Angered by the desertions, General Taylor ordered his men to shoot any soldier trying to cross the Rio Grande to Matamoros. 2 days later, sentries shot to death 2 immigrant soldiers. But even the shootings did not deter the defections. The U.S. officers became furious when they learned that John Riley himself was recruiting deserters into a foreign legion within the Mexican army. He dubbed his unit the St. Patrick's Battalion, after St. Patrick, Ireland's patron saint. The Mexicans called them the San Patricios. Riley felt a close affinity with the Mexican people. In a letter to a former employer in the States, he wrote,
"Be not deceived by the prejudice of a nation that is at war with Mexico. For a more hospitable and friendlier people than the Mexicans, there exist not on the face of the earth."
Riley's outlook contrasted sharply with the views of his fellow soldiers. They regarded the Mexicans as lazy and inferior to whites. The Illinois State Register reflected this attitude. The Mexicans are reptiles in the path of democracy. They must either crawl or be crushed.
Much of this prejudice being directed against the Mexicans was on religious grounds, and this was something that I think hit at the very gut of many of the Irish. They understood this kind of class consciousness where many Americans viewed the Mexicans as being somehow inferior, not just by benefit of religion, but also somehow innately inferior to the Anglo-Saxon, if you will. The Irish background, obviously, the Protestant aggressor was the English. Now you had, in the Mexicans' eyes, England's stepchild, the Protestants from America coming to take over Mexico. And I think the Irish, on some level, at a very basic level, a gut level, could relate to this.
When war broke out with Mexico, John Riley was already known as a traitor among the U.S. officer corps. He and other deserters had been spotted on the Mexican side, firing artillery shells across the Rio Grande at U.S. positions. But Riley and his men were soon outmaneuvered and forced to retreat with the Mexican army to Monterrey, where they took up positions against their former companions. The Yankees again prevailed in Monterrey. Defeated, the Mexicans were permitted to withdraw with their arms. Riley and his followers were jeered by Taylor's forces as they retreated toward the south. But even as they bowed their heads in defeat, more U.S. deserters joined their ranks. In January 1847, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna returned from exile in Cuba to lead his country in an all-out war with the United States. Santa Anna organized an army in San Luis Potosí to halt General Taylor's advance from the north. The Mexican press reported that the San Patricios marched in the lead column.
These brave men have abandoned one of the most unjust of causes to defend the territory of their adopted country. They will find in the Mexicans a frank, loyal heart, open and hospitable.
The showdown between the two armies occurred at a narrow pass called La Angostura. Initially, Mexican troops broke through Taylor's left flank as the San Patricios pounded the American positions with blistering artillery fire from 3 heavy guns. Taylor ordered his cavalry to destroy the batteries, but their charge failed. The Mexicans seemed to be winning, but Santa Anna decided to withdraw, leaving the victory to the Americans. At the battle's end, more than 1/3 of the San Patricios lay dead and wounded. One of Santa Anna's generals, Francisco Mejia, wrote,
The San Patricio Company is worthy of the most consummate praise because they fought with daring bravery.
By February 1847, the U.S. Army had conquered California and most of northern Mexico. But General Santa Anna refused to surrender. Major General Winfield Scott assumed command for the next phase of the war. Scott was a Virginia gentleman whose obsession with military regulations earned him the title Old Fuss and Feathers. His orders were to invade Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico with 9,000 men. The amphibious invasion was the largest the Americans had ever attempted. The Yankees lobbed thousands of shells into the city, destroying hospitals and churches and killing hundreds of civilians. Colonel Ethan Allen Hitchcock wrote,
I shall never forget the horrible fire of our mortars, going with dreadful certainty and bursting with sepulchral tones, often in the center of private dwellings. It was awful. I shudder to think about it.
In the end, the Mexicans were forced to surrender Veracruz, preparing the way for the Yankee assault on Mexico City. As the Americans advanced, they found the road to the capital littered with leaflets from General Santa Anna, urging them to desert and offering them each 200 acres of land.
Sons of Ireland, have you forgotten that in any Spanish country, it is enough to claim Ireland as your home on our word of honor? We are willing to grant you as much land as you need.
War-weary and disillusioned, U.S. soldiers responded to Santa Anna's offer and joined the San Patricios. In the summer of 1847, the Mexican army retreated to the capital city with the Americans in pursuit. The mood was panicky, and the Archbishop warned that if the Americans won, they would steal the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. The two armies clashed near the gates of Mexico City at the small village of Churubusco. Churubusco was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. It was also the final campaign for the San Patricios as a unit. Captain Ephraim Kirby Smith.
The roll of Mexican fire exceeded anything I have ever heard. The roar of cannon and musketry, the screams of the wounded, the awful cry of horses and mules, and the yells of combatants combined in a sound as hellish as can be conceived.
The San Patricios suffered heavy losses, and 60% of their men were killed or captured. Even the Americans respected their bravery. Colonel Albert Ramsey of the 11th U.S. Infantry wrote,
Their deportment deserves the greatest eulogies. Since all the time the attack lasted, they sustained the fire with extraordinary courage. A great number of them fell in the action, while those who survived suffered soon after a cruel death, improper in a civilized age.
After the Churubusco convent fell to the Americans, a 6-week armistice was declared. During the ceasefire, John Riley and 71 other San Patricios were brought to trial.
The court didn't seem to care how they got into the Mexican army, whether they were forced into it or whether they willingly joined the Mexican army. The fact was they were wearing a Mexican uniform at this court-martial, and they had witnesses testifying that they had been in both armies.
During the court-martial, some of the defendants claimed that they were forced into the Mexican army. Others testified that they joined because they were drunk, a lesser offense under military law than desertion.
Well, the explanation that they deserted the American army and joined the Mexican army simply because they were drunk doesn't make any sense to me at all. I can see deserting an army if you were drunk, but I can't see joining another army and fighting to the death against your former comrades, knowing that if you were captured or defeated, that your fate was almost certainly to be executed simply because you were drunk. I would suggest instead that the actions of those Irish immigrants who joined the San Patricio Brigade were in part rooted in an alienation from American society, an alienation from their officers and from the army in which they had been treated so poorly. And I would also suggest that it reflects their growing realization that the United States was not fighting a war of liberty, but that instead it was fighting a war of conquest, and that it was fighting against people who were fellow Catholics such as themselves.
It would have been insane, virtually insane, for these guys who were captured in Mexican uniforms, fighting their old comrades, fighting desperately against them, to offer any defense on ideological, religious, or ethnic grounds. Now, the only defense a lot of them felt they could offer was that they had no intentions to desert. They had gotten drunk, which was an infraction, a punishable infraction in the U.S. Army, but certainly not one that would have won them a death sentence.
Riley's life was spared because he had deserted before war was declared. He and 15 others were sentenced to be branded and flogged. General Scott ordered 50 San Patricios